With the arrival of Donald Trump on the scene and the introduction of his tariff-based trade policy, there was a brief hope that EU-China relations would improve. However, it didn't take long for reality to kick in. One of the clearest indications of the differences between the EU and China is how they chose to respond to the threat of import tariffs. China, on the one hand, assertive, unrelenting, uncompromising, meet fire with fire kind of response, while in contrast, the EU took a characteristically diplomacy-first response, with the often repeated line of, "We have left all options on the table, but we would really prefer a negotiated solution." The opportunity to stand up to the bullying tactics of the US and their subsequent retreat has left China emboldened on the global stage, with implications for its various trading partners. In this context, the EU and China met in Beijing for their annual summit, a mechanism of the relationship aimed at prioritizing open and frank dialogue between the two superpowers to iron out issues or even just to air them. As China becomes more dominant in global affairs, it's important that we remember, just 50 years ago it suffered from widespread poverty and economic isolation. In this short time, China has pulled 800 million of its people out of poverty, with an average annual growth rate of about 9%. In 2024, China exported 519 billion euros worth of goods to the EU, making it the EU's third largest trading partner. However, the story starts to sour here. While China sends 14.5% of its exports to Europe, it only receives 8% of the EU's exports in return. This leaves an enormous trade deficit, which in 2024 was 306 billion euros, obviously a major concern for EU leaders. In an attempt to protect its industries, the EU slapped steep tariffs on Chinese EVs, and it also excluded Chinese companies from involvement in public procurement of medical technology. And to show that it was serious about the Russian matter, the EU included two of China's banks in its latest sanctions package. This obviously attracted retaliation, ensuring a tense climate and respectful disdain at this year's summit. To understand better why the waters of EU-China relations are so rough, we need to look a little deeper at a few factors. EU-China relations have predominantly revolved around trade, which continues to be the main engine of their engagement. The EU, recognizing the growing stature of China and the threat to its own economic prosperity and security, took a strategic approach to safeguard its interests. Firstly, the EU defined its relationship with China in a rather complex way. It sees China as a partner for cooperation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. It considers China a vital trading partner and has no intention of really cutting ties with them, either economic, social, political, or scientific, but stresses that trade should be fair and mutually beneficial. Recognizing the need to protect its interests rather than cutting ties, the EU is pursuing a strategy of de-risking. De-risking involves diversifying supply chains and reducing dependency on a single supplier. In contrast, China's primary objective is to retain access to the EU's markets, as well as direct foreign investment from the European Union. With its growing assertiveness, it has used its dominance over supply to apply pressure in negotiations. On matters of trade, the EU's growing trade deficit is a major concern for leaders in industry. Remaining competitive and capable is essential, especially considering the large investments that are being made in areas like green tech and sustainable energy. However, von der Leyen's concern, which she took to Beijing, is that the imbalance in trade is not a result of fair and open competition, but it's rather a symptom of market distortion by the Chinese government. Her message was quite clear. Basically, she said that we've reached an inflection point. For trade to remain mutually beneficial, it must become more balanced. In order to bring trade back into line, she raised three priorities that she needs the Chinese to address: market access, overcapacity in China fueled by subsidized production, and export controls. European companies find that they do not really have the ability to penetrate the Chinese market, notably because of the China First policy, which creates an unfair playing field where local companies seem to have preferential access to public tenders and procurement. Overcapacity in China's economy, driven by subsidized production, outstrips local demand. The excess subsidized production is then offloaded into other more open markets, damaging local industries that cannot compete. This is particularly evident in steel, EVs, batteries, and solar panels. With the aim of protecting its clean energy transition agenda and the substantial investment that is involved, the EU launched an investigation into subsidized distortion of electric vehicles coming from China. This resulted in a substantial tariff recently introduced. China have acknowledged the concerns related to oversupply locally and started looking into it. They use the term involution to refer to this matter. The term involution has become a buzzword in China that refers to the excessive, cutthroat style of competition that has emerged in several industries as companies facing weak domestic demand and oversupply problems slash prices in a bid to attract customers. Von der Leyen stressed that if excessive subsidized oversupply continues to make its way into the EU, it will be difficult for the EU to maintain its current level of openness. The third major hurdle in trade dynamics is the export controls imposed on rare earths and permanent magnets. China accounts for about 98% of the EU's rare earth supply, creating a very dangerous dependency, given that China has already demonstrated a willingness to use its economic dominance to get its way. In 2010, it cut off supply of rare earths to Japan due to rising tensions, and it also recently restricted imports from Australia when the Australian government questioned the origins of COVID. Wary of the risk of overdependence on a single supplier, the EU has tried to emphasize that it's in China's best interest to be seen as a reliable and trusted supplier. Shifting from trade to security, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought fear and insecurity to Europe. No one fully understands Putin's ambitions or what will happen if Ukraine falls. The EU has pinned its hopes for security and stability on a strong Ukraine, and in this vein they've been reminding China of its role as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and the need to uphold international law and the rules-based order. However, it's not clear if it's had any effect as China continues to prop up Russia's economy. The war in Ukraine is so central to Europe's security that von der Leyen has told China that the way they continue to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor in our relationship going forward. On a recent visit to the Kremlin, President Xi said that right now there are changes, the likes of which we have not seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together. He also told the Chinese Communist Party's conference that he wanted China to become a world leader in composite national strength and international influence by 2024. With its Belt and Road Initiative, China has become the largest lender to developing nations. By von der Leyen's analysis, China has moved from an era of reform and openness to an era of security and control. They have become more oppressive at home and more assertive abroad. China has hardened its military posture, ramped up policies of disinformation, demonstrated its willingness to use economic and trade coercion to get its way or as a retaliation, created parallel international institutions and banks, and made a clear push to make the world more dependent on China while becoming less dependent on the world. She further states that China's clear goal is systemic change of the international order with China at the center. The EU has issued clear warnings to China, threatening to limit access to its lucrative markets if its key concerns are not addressed. Market distortions, dumping on the European market, support for Russia amidst its continued invasion of Ukraine, and human rights issues related to its domestic matters. The inflection point of EU-China relations is fast approaching. Whether the waters of EU-China relations settle down or turn into a full-blown storm depends on China's response to EU concerns, and of course how firmly the EU decides to hold to its demands and follow through with its threats.